Good day. Yesterday, I passed on reports that President Zelensky had supposedly instructed General Syrskyi, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, to launch some sort of counterattack in Bakhmut on the 3rd and 4th of May. These reports originated in rumours that have appeared on Ukrainian Telegram channels. Well, today is the 3rd of May, and as of this moment in time, there's little sign of any Ukrainian counterattacks in the Bakhmut area taking place. What we have instead is a different Prigozhin from the one that I talked about yesterday. Yesterday, I passed on the angry, upset, furious Prigozhin. He just lost, according to him, 94 men, dead or wounded, in fighting in Bakhmut. He was blaming the Russian Defense Ministry for this. He was extremely critical, making all kinds of claims about treason and such things. Today, by contrast, he seems much more confident again. And speaking about the situation yesterday, 2nd of May, he says this: today, 2nd May, Wagner units advanced up to 160 meters in various directions of the city of Bakhmut. The enemy controls an area of around 2.7 square kilometers. We have taken 50,000 square meters under control. And that was what Prigozhin said late last night. Now, can I say something about these 2.7 square kilometers of territory that Prigozhin says Ukraine still controls in Bakhmut? I've now seen film of the area which is under Ukrainian control in Bakhmut. And there were two things to say. Firstly, the shelling, the Russian shelling of this 2.7 square kilometers of territory is extraordinarily intense. It seems that after the failed Ukrainian counterattack of 2 days ago, and by the way, reports now all confirm that this Ukrainian counterattack actually did take place and that it has failed, that the Ukrainians were pushed back in every place where they sought to advance. Anyway, the effect of that Ukrainian counterattack, and quite possibly that complaint by Prigozhin that I discussed yesterday, was a massive escalation of Russian shelling of the remaining area of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control, and further shelling of the roads that lead into Bakhmut. The road that passes through Khromovo, which is, as I said, now fiercely contested, at least for a period of time. The Wagner forces appear to have actually reached and captured stretches of the road. I'm not sure whether they still do. The Ukrainians say they don't. Quite possibly on this issue, the Ukrainians are right. But anyway, all of that still seems to be contested, but Russian shelling seems to have intensified massively in and around Bakhmut against the Ukrainian forces over the last 24 hours. But the other thing I wanted to say is that this area of Bakhmut still under control, Ukrainian control, it seems to me, it looks like small clusters of isolated buildings, isolated from each other, surrounded by woodland. In other words, we're no longer talking about a proper urban landscape at all anymore. We're talking instead about an area which, whilst it may still be within the metropolitan area of Bakhmut, is essentially very suburban indeed. And these buildings did come across to me as having more some kind of office than residential purpose. They were clearly not industrial buildings, but they could be buildings that form part of this medical college that we've been hearing so much about. But certainly it didn't look like these were buildings that, as I said, were either serving a industrial function or which were housing people. So it is clearly the case now, or so it seems to me from the pictures that I saw, and bear in mind, I can't always see pictures very clearly, but from the pictures that I saw, that to all intents and purposes, Bakhmut now is fully under Russian control. All that is left is some buildings which may form part of the metropolitan territory of the town, but are perhaps more properly understood as being just outside it. And by the way, I believe the same is also true in Marinka. It seems to me, again, from what I've seen, from the pictures that I've seen of Marinka, a far more devastated place than Bakhmut, by the way. I mean, Bakhmut has been shattered by the fighting. I mean, I don't think there's a single building that I've seen in the pictures of Bakhmut, which I have seen, which is still standing. But anyway, one can still see the shells of buildings in Bakhmut. In Marinka, it's actually worse than that. I mean, it looks more like Pompeii, frankly, that's sort of an archaeological site that's been devastated, or then it looks like a place which was inhabited by people fairly recently, which, by the way, might suggest that the fighting in Marinka has been even more intense than the fighting in Bakhmut. As I said, it's not as I've said on several occasions, it is not necessarily the case that because we're getting more information about the fighting in Bakhmut than we're getting about the fighting in other places, that fighting in other places has not been as intense as it has been in Bakhmut itself. Anyway, this is Prigozhin. He says his forces are advancing again. They've been pushing forward. There were some reports, by the way, that the Wagner forces captured two more blocks of buildings in Bakhmut over the course of the previous day. They're said to be advancing further today. I have to say that, to me, this battle does increasingly look like it is all but over. Why the Ukrainians cling on to these buildings on the western fringes of Bakhmut, why they still defend places like the former location of the MiG-17 monument, it's difficult to understand from a military perspective. It seems to me that we're talking now about pure symbolism. And incidentally, and on the question of casualties in Bakhmut, there's been many, many pictures now, many harrowing pictures extending back weeks, but a whole big cluster of them coming out yesterday of Ukrainian vehicles, machines, armored vehicles sometimes, lots of lorries and such things, destroyed on the so-called Road of Life, the road that passes through Khromovo into Bakhmut, and also, I'm sorry to say, lots of pictures of dead soldiers. And of course, I'm not in a position to identify whether these are Russian soldiers or Ukrainian soldiers, but most of the captions that go with those photos suggest that they're Ukrainians. And there have been lots of pictures of these dead soldiers, some of them, I have to say, looking, frankly, they're not just dead, but terribly dead. I'm not going to say more. Anyway, so that seems to me the position in Bakhmut. Now, as I said, today's the 3rd of May. Perhaps the offensive, the Ukrainian counterattack, will take place on the 4th of May. I don't know. I have to say, I think it's unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to cling on to all of these buildings up to and including the 9th of May, when the Russians celebrate Victory Day. But who's to say? It will depend, I suppose, on how aggressively the Russians push forward in Bakhmut and how fiercely the Ukrainians continue to defend themselves. By the way, the Russian news agency TASS has a rather sad, at least I found it sad, report about the fighting in Bakhmut. It says that supplies presumably have become so short for the Ukrainian troops there that they have been obliged to turn increasingly to using old equipment, vintage machine guns. I'll report this. I'm not sure how meaningful this is, but anyway, this is a report supposedly from TASS, but it's based on claims from somebody called Stanislav, who's said to be a former Ukrainian soldier. And it says obsolete Maxim machine guns dating back to the early last century. The Maxim actually was developed in the 19th century, but the Russians continued to use it well into the 20th century, and it played a big role in the Russian Civil War that took place after the Russian Revolution. Obsolete Maxim machine guns dating back to the early last century were retrieved from weapons depots inside a coal mine in Bakhmut to be supplied to Ukrainian troops. Stanislav, a former Ukrainian military officer who guarded the depot, told the media. I'm not sure which media. My impression is the Russian media, because we're subsequently told that Stanislav deserted and was hiding in Bakhmut for almost a year, waiting for the Russians to take over. Anyway, he goes on to say, and this is a report, I served in the Ukrainian army at the Volodyarsky coal mine. There were warehouses with weapons, millions of pieces. Contrary to rumours, not everything was taken out in 2014. Small arms, grenade launchers, and Kalashnikov's Maxim machine guns remained. When it all started, for 2.5 months, all this hardware was taken out. Truckloads of it, including Maxim machine guns, were sent to military units. We were going to lay down weapons as soon as the Russian forces came to go down in the cellar. I personally wasn't going to fight this war. Anyway, that's what this particular person says. I cover this because there's also a report that the Wagner organization troops have now discovered a similar massive weapons depot or supply or whatever it is, hidden deep in the salt mines in Soledar, that they've only recently come across it, that there were apparently hundreds of thousands of pieces of small arms, ammunition and weapons buried deep inside the salt mine, and presumably there for use by these Ukrainian soldiers. These are clearly old Soviet weapons dumps, but if we're to believe Stanislav, I don't see why not, the Ukrainians were still intending to use some of these weapons in order to defend themselves in this fighting, and presumably they did. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. That's a curious story, one that's been much talked about by people. I'm not sure how important it is. Maxim guns can certainly be effective, I would have thought, in modern warfare if used properly. But anyway, it does seem as if the Ukrainians were indeed using some of these old weapons, and perhaps they still are. So that's the situation in Bakhmut. Now, across the rest of the conflict area, the front lines, we're hearing less at the moment about fighting that's going on, though I get the impression that there is in fact a great deal of fighting going on. What is happening, and this is clearly connected to all the talk and rumours and preparations for the Ukrainian offensive, is that there's massive missile and drone strikes going on backwards and forwards across the front lines. I say massive. The Russian strikes are massive. Over the last night, large quantities of geranium drones appear to have attacked various Ukrainian positions up and down the front lines. There's been more attacks on Ukrainian positions in places like Kherson region, Zaporozhye region, what I will continue to refer to as Dnipropetrovsk region. I don't know what the Ukrainian name for it is. And apparently there's been attacks and explosions in the capital of this particular region, Dnipro itself. There's also reports of explosions in Kiev. And interestingly, also some reports of explosions in Chernigov region, in places like Sumy and Chernigov, in the north of Ukraine, not far from the Russian border. Possibly bomb attacks here, who's to say? But anyway, extensive Russian missile, drone, and perhaps bomb attacks right across the front line. By contrast, there have also been Ukrainian attacks on Russian positions, but they are far more limited in scale. For the second day in a row, an explosive device inside Russia managed to derail the train. Again, doesn't seem to have been much damage to the train, which was derailed. I mean, there weren't fires or explosions and nobody seems to have been killed, but potentially they might have been. But anyway, a second train derailment in as many days, and more drone attacks, Ukrainian drone attacks focused on Crimea and the area around, and in particular, a drone attack on a massive Russian fuel center in the Taman Peninsula, which is, by the way, located in pre-2014 Russia. It's not located in Crimea itself. But anyway, this is a place where, as I said, there's very, very major storage. The Russians store large amounts of fuel and other things. Now, if this drone attack had destroyed this entire facility, which appears to be very big, then that would have been a significant blow. But in fact, only one drone seems to have got through, and it did manage to hit one tank, and that did cause a fire, and the fire was visible in Kerch, which is in Crimea itself. These fires can be spectacular and very high, but it only affected one tank out of scores, perhaps hundreds, supposedly. So again, this seems to have been a pinprick as opposed to a successful attack. Other drones apparently were launched against this facility, but they don't seem to have got through. And the suggestion increasingly is that they're not just being shot down, but that they are being jammed by Russian electronic warfare devices. I have to say that what we're seeing is a pattern. It's big Russian drone and missile attacks attacking Ukrainian ammunition positions, ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, causing very extensive damage, causing all kinds of damage that it's perhaps difficult to keep a full track on, hitting targets simultaneously right across Ukraine, doing a huge amount of damage that way. And as I said, these much smaller pinprick attacks that Ukraine can manage with its drones, only a few of which get through, and sabotage attacks like the ones on the train. Now, on the question of sabotage attacks, a Ukrainian sabotage group, has apparently just been arrested in Crimea. There's clearly another one operating in Melitopol. They've tried various assassination attempts against Russian officials, some of which have been successful. I suspect the Russian security forces are busy trying to track down these people. Maybe they will eventually find them. Again, I have to say, these kind of attacks don't seem to me to have much significance in military terms, but perhaps from a Ukrainian point of view, they do in some way give the impression that Ukraine is hitting back against the Russians in some form. What the Ukrainians have been doing is that even as they have only very limited ability to strike deep into targets within Russia itself, and the days of the Strij drones flying deep inside Russia, reaching the Engels air base, hundreds of kilometers from the border, for the moment at least, those days seem to have passed. Anyway, whilst the Ukrainians do, as I say, carry out these minor attacks with little military significance, I suppose they do have the effect of keeping Ukrainian morale high. And the other thing that the Ukrainians are doing is that they carry out more shelling of Donetsk city, which is the one city, well, of course, they would dispute that it is within Russia, but the Russians claim it as being within Russia. The one city that they can reach on a regular basis, significant city that they can reach on a regular basis with their artillery. And this has been an ongoing story for years and years. Again, it has no military significance. It has, I think, frankly, appalling moral quality, striking against, as far as I can see, indiscriminately against a civilian target. But there we are. It is what the Ukrainians have been doing, and I suspect that they're doing it as much for psychological reasons, to keep the people in Donetsk city anxious and worried and fearful, but also to keep up, sustain morale up to a certain point amongst their own military and their own people. Now, whilst I am mentioning this event, there is yesterday was a commemoration across Russia, though not Ukraine, of another event which happened back in 2014, which is the fire at the trade union building in Odessa, where protesters who were opposed to the events, the change of power that took place in Ukraine in February 2014, and who unquestionably did want to see at least Odessa return to Russia. Anyway, they were burnt out in a horrible fire in the trade union building in Odessa. And as far as I'm concerned, and I follow those events carefully, there was never any doubt that the fire was set on purpose. I accept that there has been no proper investigation of the causes of this fire, and that there have been many explanations for it, alternative explanations for it. But as I said, I followed the events very carefully, and it seemed to me clear that that was what happened. And ever since, this event has had a powerful hold on the Russian imagination, which is completely understandable given how horrifying it was, and which, in my opinion, was perhaps the single most important event, even more so than the change of power that took place in Kiev in February, in triggering the conflict that goes on to this day. It was the moment when opinion in Russia turned, public opinion in Russia turned decisively against Ukraine. And by the way, it was also the moment when the West lost, in my opinion, moral responsibility for what was taking place in Ukraine. The fact that these people were burned to death in that fashion, that the West largely ignored this event. There were some mumbled words of concern, but nothing more. That there was no real pressure for a proper investigation and an accounting of those responsible. That the event has passed, the anniversary of the event has passed, entirely ignored, as far as I can see, in the Western media. Well, that explains a great deal about the collapse in relations between Russia and Ukraine, obviously, but between Russia and the West also, and about why people in Russia have lost faith in the West. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this event further. Anybody who wants to take a different view to it is welcome to express it in the threads to this video. And of course, I've no doubt that some will, but I've made my own opinion about it clear, and I think the facts support what I have said. Anyway, so there we go. As I said, lots of missile strikes, lots of drone attacks. Before I finish, I just say a few more things, which is that the drones that Ukraine is now apparently using in carrying out some of these sabotage attacks, some of these attacks on these facilities, apparently are converted Chinese drones. These are civilian drones made by a Chinese company, bought in bulk by Ukraine and adapted for this kind of use. Ukraine may have some more sophisticated drones. Allegedly, it bought a large number from Taiwan recently, which it might want to use or intend to use in its coming offensive. There was reports of swarm attacks on Crimea being planned. But for the moment, it is these adaptations of Chinese drones that Ukraine appears to be using. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation in terms of the battlefields, the fighting, if you like, that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. What else is going on? Well, yesterday I discussed at length John Kirby's, in my opinion, utterly bizarre claims about Russian losses in Bakhmut. Now, I said a few things about that, one of which was that it seemed to me that Kirby's comments bore all the hallmarks of an internal row, of a bureaucratic battle that was underway. It seemed to me quite clear that there were powerful arguments going on within the US government about the direction of the war, that there's the hardliners, the Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland axis that want to continue the war until some kind of victory is achieved. And then there's a more realist group which clearly includes General Milley. We'll come to him in a moment. But also, obviously, General Cavoli, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces, NATO forces in Europe, who gave that report to the House Armed Services Committee that I discussed a day or so ago, in which he said that the Russian army is now bigger than it was before the war began, that the Russian Air Force and Russian Navy and Russian missile forces are as vigorous as ever and have been almost entirely unaffected by the war. And by the way, he also said that after the war has ended, Russia will actually have more capable ground forces, having learnt the lessons and absorbed the lessons of the war, than the forces that it has today. So that was General Cavoli taking a very different view about what's actually happened over the course of the war than much of the Western media has. Anyway, we now have certain comments by General Milley, who of course spoke to General Zaluzhny yesterday. And these comments were given in an interview to Foreign Affairs magazine. And he says this: I do think that the probability of either side achieving their political objectives, war is about politics through the sole use of military power. I think that's going to be very difficult, very challenging. And frankly, I don't think the probability of that is likely in this year. Now, that doesn't seem to me a very confident statement to make on the eve of a Ukrainian offensive. It doesn't look as if he expects this Ukrainian offensive to achieve anything decisive. Now, I'm going to come to the Ukrainian offensive shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to say quickly that I think that if the Ukrainian offensive completely fails, if the Ukrainians not only fail to gain ground, but are so weakened that the Russians are able to launch a counterattack, then I think that there is a possibility that the war could end this year and that it might end on Russian terms, that the Russians might win a clear-cut victory in Ukraine in the second half of this year. I agree with General Milley that it is most unlikely that the Ukrainians will win this war this year. But I'm going to say something further, which is that if Ukraine doesn't win its war this year, then I don't think it is going to win this war at all. And I wanted to just make a particular point about Western commentaries, Western media commentary at the moment. There is a lot of talk about the war being in stalemate, and that if Ukraine's offensive doesn't succeed, the stalemate will supposedly continue. Stalemate, the word stalemate, as used in the Western media and by Western politicians and pundits, is actually a euphemism, and I think people should understand this. It is code for the fact that Ukraine will face defeat. We are not in a stalemate situation. We are in a war of attrition. And it is a war of attrition which Ukraine is losing. Even Western commentators concede this. Given that this is so, the longer the war of attrition continues in the way that it is being conducted at the moment, the more certain and complete the Ukrainian defeat is going to be. Notice, going back to what General Cavoli said, the Russian army is now bigger than it was, and at the end of this war, the Russians are going to have a more capable army than the one they started the war with. In other words, this is not a stalemate in which each side is bogged down and unable to make progress. Rather, it is a stalemate in which one side Russia. Every week, every month, perhaps every day, is getting stronger. And the other side, Ukraine, running out of men. And there's now reports that the Ukrainian government has had to bring back wounded officers to take over positions because there aren't fit officers left, things like that. Running out of men, desperately short of ammunition, lacking an air defense system. And by the way, there was a report also yesterday that a senior British commentator actually urged Ukraine to stop using its limited stock of air defense missiles to shoot down Russian cruise missiles, to let some of these Russian cruise missiles and drones through, rather than fritter away what little air defense assets it still has, which highlights how bad the situation has become. Anyway, in that situation where Ukraine is short of men, short of machines, lacks an air force, lacks air defense capabilities, one cannot talk about a stalemate. And all of those commentators in the West who use that word, if you read their articles carefully, know it. They know that time is not on Ukraine's side in this war. They cannot openly talk about a defeat for Ukraine. We're not yet in the situation where admitting that is acceptable. So instead, we talk about stalemate, but as I said, it is a euphemism for eventual Ukrainian defeat. So I just wanted to clarify that point, because clearly that is the concern. And that now brings me to the other side of this debate. We've just heard what Millie had to say about the fact that he isn't confident that Ukraine is going to achieve a breakthrough this year, a victory this year. In which case, he is basically setting the scene for a Ukrainian defeat, because Russia is getting stronger. And I'm going to suggest that this is exactly why the other side in this debate, this argument in Washington, the Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland camp, are pressing so hard for an offensive. Because an offensive and gains achieved through it is, from their point of view, the only thing they have left. Now, I received a very interesting email from a viewer who I believe, who is in fact a former State Department official. Again, it's a private email, so I'm not going to say who it is. But this person drew my attention to the fact that the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Michael McCall, spoke about the offensive, Ukraine's offensive, and that its purpose was to push Russian forces back so as to put Ukraine in a position where it could call for a ceasefire, after which, and I'm now quoting McCall, we can then maybe have negotiations to finally resolve this. In other words, the plan is to carry out an offensive, capture some territory, and then seek negotiations. Try to extricate the United States and the West from this debacle. Put Ukraine in a strong position from which basically it can sue for peace. And this, I should say, extremely astute and insightful person who has sent me this message has also questioned why Russia would agree, because the Russians have, of course, shown that they're prepared sometimes to give ground in the event of a Ukrainian attack, so as not to defend positions that are undefendable and throw away lives trying to do so. But he does wonder whether, if Ukraine did make an offer in those terms, there might be some people in Moscow, as he puts it, who might be foolish enough to agree. I can reassure him. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, basically has already shot down that particular balloon in his comments at the United Nations. He already has said that any idea that the Russians would agree to a ceasefire after Ukraine made some gains as a result of a limited offensive, of their offensive, is absurd. He called that kind of thinking schizophrenic. He said that what the West is proposing is to put Ukraine in a position where it would be more threatening to Russia rather than less, and given that the entire point of the special operation is to make Ukraine less dangerous to Russia than it had previously been, agreeing to a ceasefire and peace on those sort of terms would make no sense for Russia at all. So I think that if that is the Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland plan, which for all I know it is, then I think already one can say that the Russians, through Lavrov, have rejected it. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, I will finish this rundown of the military side of things by saying that there's been a meeting, apparently in Moscow, in the Russian Defense Ministry, chaired by Shoigu, General Shoigu, the defense minister, in which he's discussed the situation on the battlefronts. He says that the Russian forces in Ukraine are now fully supplied with the ammunition they need. He talked about major increases in arms production in Russia. He gave a figure for an overall increase in arms production of 170%. He said that some types of weapon systems have seen production increases, sevenfold production increases. He also put total Ukrainian casualties in April at 15,000. Now, notice that unlike Kirby's fantastic figures of 20,000 dead, Shoigu is not saying that 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in Ukraine in the fighting in April. He says that Ukraine suffered 15,000 casualties, so that includes dead and wounded. But it is still a very high casualty rate. For the record, I think it might be correct. Shoigu also pointed out that Ukrainian casualties in April were significantly higher than they had been in March, and that does suggest that the intensity of the fighting in Bakhmut, the fact that Ukraine is trying to send reinforcements to Bakhmut all the time, might be adding to Ukrainian losses on a very significant scale. Whilst I'm talking about Ukrainian losses, by the way, Prigozhin sort of suggested that the Ukrainian general in command of Ukraine's territorial forces, its reserve brigades, some of which have been sent into battle, was killed near Bakhmut yesterday. Ukraine categorically denies that, and I'm sure that Ukraine is correct. Now, let me now move on to another very interesting piece that I saw in the Western media. I say interesting because it gives us a very interesting perspective on Western thinking, or at least Anglo-American thinking. And it is about India and about the relationship between India and Russia. And this article starts with this extraordinary, very ominous headline: India is sliding into Putin's hands. New Delhi, we're told, is keeping Russia solvent for no better reason than somewhat cheaper oil. Notice the comment, no better reason. And then it goes on to say that the West has traditionally seen India as a friend, but when it comes to actions rather than words, the world's fifth biggest economy pays more attention to what Vladimir Putin wants than it does to the desires of Washington or London. That is already, I find, an interesting choice of words. Could it be that what really concerns the government of India is not what Vladimir Putin wants or what Washington or London want, but India's interests, India's national interests, and specifically what the Indian people might want and might need? Anyway, we then go on to read that imports of oil, that India has saved around $3 billion in the past year, compared to its total annual import bill of nearly $120 billion. And the point is made, this isn't perhaps a huge amount, but we then go on to read that India has been having inflation worries. And an economy that big as India's is needs huge amounts of energy, and India is heavily dependent on imports. And there is a comment from somebody called Susanna Streeter, who is head of money and markets at Hargreaves Lansdown. And this person, she goes on to say, inflation worries, rather than geopolitical concerns, have taken center stage, leading New Delhi to brush away Western reprobation about increasing economic ties with Moscow. The approach appears to be working, with India's headline inflation rate going in the right direction, helped by lower food prices. But the price spiral is still not unwinding fast enough to meet the central bank's target. And another commentator, Osama Rizvi, energy analyst at Primary Vision, says they are interdependent about Russia and India. India, which imports more than 85% of its oil, and Russia, which depends on the proceeds from oil and gas for almost 50% of its revenue. The last, by the way, is completely wrong. Not 50% of its revenue, perhaps 50% of its export revenue, though even that, by the way, I think is perhaps an overstatement. As I have discussed many times, if you're talking about Russian domestic revenue, oil and gas receipts probably account now for around 20 to 25%, if that. These are historic figures that I've just given. They might not be true any longer. But anyway, to continue, Refinitiv Oil Research Analysis forecasts that India will import 1.94 million barrels per day from Russia. It's almost 2 million barrels a day, more than doubling since last July and exceeding total imports from the Middle East. And the article goes on to say Russia has been able to escape the worst effects of the penalties imposed by the West. Non-sanctioning countries like India have propped up the crude oil export sales, which are one of the main factors preventing Russia from going bankrupt. By the way, that isn't entirely true either. But let's press on, then the article talks about the long history of relations between India and Russia, going all the way back to Tsar Paul at the beginning of the 18th century, how Russian relations with India were very strong during the Soviet era, and how Russia continues to be India's primary supplier of advanced weapons. And then we're told that Prime Minister Modi has never condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nor have many countries, by the way. Meanwhile, relations between Russia are only set to strengthen, with the two countries in advanced negotiations on establishing a free trade agreement, a move that will further stoke tensions with the West. And then we go back to Susanna Streeter. Pushing down energy prices will be the priority of the Modi administration. So maintaining good trade relations with Moscow will continue to be seen in the national interest, despite sharp disapproval behind diplomatic doors. And then the article by Angela Barnes finishes with these words. A lot of Westerners think of India as a benign, neutral democracy which should naturally align with liberal values against the bloody-handed tyranny of Russia. But the Indians don't see it that way, and the blunt truth is they're keeping Vladimir Putin in business for no better reason than slightly cheaper oil. Now, I want to take a step back and I want to just think about what this article says. India is a democracy. The article accepts that. There's been some criticism in the West of Prime Minister Modi. You're starting to read all sorts of flesh-creeping articles suddenly appearing about how Prime Minister Modi and his government are gradually leading India away from democracy. But anyway, that is a relatively new phenomenon. Until fairly recently, Prime Minister Modi has been the toast of the cocktail circuits in Washington and London because of India's membership of organizations like the Quad and the assumption that India is going to be some sort of help in securing the Western position against China. But anyway, let's take it as read, as Angela Barnes, in fairness, largely does, that India remains a democracy. Apparently it is not a benign democracy anymore. It's not aligning with liberal values. It's pursuing its own interests. It is working instead to reduce inflation in India itself by buying cheaper oil from Russia, and that supposedly somehow trumps, in some kind of cynical way, the defense of liberal values in alliance with the West, and somehow means instead that India is aligned with the bloody-handed tyranny of modern Russia. Notice how in that last paragraph, Angela Barnes speaks of Westerners thinking of India as a benign, neutral democracy. But neutrality is obviously something that is very qualified here because it presupposes some kind of alliance against the bloody-handed tyranny of modern Russia with the West. Now, I have immediate problems with this entire way of thinking. What this article basically says is that India is a democracy, or as a democracy, should nonetheless not prioritize the welfare of its own people. It should not seek inflation reduction within India itself, Now, bear in mind that though India has made enormous economic progress over the last 30 or so years, it remains, by Western standards, on a per capita basis, a very poor country. There are many millions, tens of millions of people in India who by any definition could be called very poor, who face acute material hardship. Now, for people in that situation, inflation, a rise in prices, an increase in the cost of living, all these nice words that we use in the West, is potentially a disaster. If you are living on the edge, then a rise in prices, particularly a rise in food prices, which is heavily connected with the price of energy, can tip you over into total catastrophe. Nonetheless, India, Prime Minister Modi, his government, supposedly should not be working to try to reduce this burden of high prices or higher prices on the Indian people. It should not be seeking to lower their costs. It should not try to safeguard their food and energy security. It should instead align with the West, accept those higher prices and all that pressure on the Indian people in defense of something called liberal values. And doing that would translate into India being a benign and neutral democracy, and apparently a friend of the West. Now, this kind of thinking, at one level, takes the concept of democracy and takes it away from that definition that Abraham Lincoln, all those years ago, gave it: government of the people, by the people, for the people. It wouldn't any longer be for the people. Certainly it would not be for the Indian people. As I said, some of them, if this kind of thinking were adopted, would be put under what for them would be unbearable breaking pressure if inflation were allowed to take hold in India. It is not about that any longer. It is about some kind of abstract conception of democracy connected to something called liberal values. Liberal values, which presumably include certain social attitudes, which in a conservative, deeply religious society, traditional society like much of India still is, might not perhaps be fully shared, certainly not in the way that some of these liberal values are interpreted in parts of the West. Anyway, put all that aside. As I said, support instead this abstract conception of democracy, which when you unpack it, when you analyze it closely, what it ultimately means is that you support the geopolitical policies of the Anglo-American powers, the English-speaking British, Western powers, the British and the Americans. So, to my mind, that isn't democracy at all. That is not how democracy is supposed to work. I prefer the older definition that a democratic government governs in the interests, the material interests, as I said, in India, pressing material interests of its people. That an Indian government should, above all, prioritize the welfare of its own people, try to keep inflation in India low, try to keep prices low, try to improve living standards of people in India, but not sacrifice them. But if you do that, if India does that, and does that in a way that contradicts Western policy, well, we're told that doing so will invite sharp disapproval behind diplomatic doors. This is what Susanna Streeter is quoted as saying in this article, and that no guesses where that sharp disapproval behind diplomatic doors is coming from. And India will at that point be accused of somehow betraying this nebulous concept of democracy, identified with these undefined, but Indians might think rather ominous concept of liberal values, and it would be seen as obviously betraying the Western powers, the Anglo-Americans, and their geopolitical policies. Now, as I said, I find this appalling thinking. I think this is completely wrong thinking. It asks India, in population terms, the biggest country in the world, perhaps it's certainly one of its biggest economies, the world's fastest growing economy, a rising great power. It says you must subordinate yourself completely to the geopolitical designs and obsessions of the Western powers. If you fail to do so, if you are not prepared to sacrifice the material conditions of life of your own people, then you are, to go back to the title of this article, sliding into Vladimir Putin's hands. This is precisely the kind of thinking that is losing the West friends. Now, I don't know anything about Angela Barnes. I don't know what her outlook is. I don't know whether, for example, she's a person with self-conscious neocon views. Perhaps not. But I do think that this article mirrors the kind of attitudes that the West has. For most of the world, for the people who live in India's great cities and villages, Ukraine is not the most important event in the world that is happening in the world today. For them, as I said, the question of lower prices for food and lower prices for energy is not a matter of luxury. It's not a matter of indifference. It's not something that they can get easily by with, as some people can do. Middle-class people perhaps can do, to some extent at least, in the West. For them, it is an actual issue of existence. This article, this outlook, doesn't recognize or acknowledge that at all. And a government, like the government of Prime Minister Modi, is inevitably going to find an attitude like this an unacceptable one. It is obviously the sort of approach that is going to annoy people in Delhi, and it is also going to annoy people right around the world as well. Now, on the topic of food prices, the grain deal that was done back in the summer, whereby the Russians agreed that Ukrainian ships would be allowed to leave Ukrainian ports laden with grain, and in return the Western powers would lift all restrictions on exports of Russian grain and Russian fertilizer. Well, the Russians have complained that that has never happened. Ukrainian grain ships have indeed been able to leave Ukrainian ports unhindered. But as the Turkish mediators have admitted, as apparently the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, in private is also admitting, the Europeans failed, apparently under American pressure, to follow through on their promises, and it has proved impossible to move Russian grain and Russian fertilizer through European ports. Restrictions on Russian grain and fertilizer have instead continued. And it seems that it is also the case that most of the Ukrainian grain ended up in Europe, lowering food prices there, sometimes to the great anger of European farmers. And so, Western governments are not perhaps quite as indifferent to inflation as they expect apparently the Indian government to be, but never mind, we won't get sidetracked on that discussion. But anyway, this grain deal is now on the brink of collapse because the Russians feel cheated, not for the first time, by the way, and they're angry, and they're saying that the grain deal from their point of view has failed, and they're preparing to pull out, and Ukrainian grain exports are now under threat again. And of course, Europe, the European Union itself, has now accepted that in Eastern Europe, restrictions on Ukrainian grain and agricultural exports, as insisted upon by local governments and local farmers, must now be reimposed. These imports must be banned. Now, that is very bad news economically for Ukraine, given the extent to which food exports by Ukraine are a critical lifeline for Ukraine itself. But again, governments around the world are going to say to themselves, governments in the global south, where, as I said, the question of food prices is of central importance, are also going to feel very angry. They're going to say, once again, the West has insisted on conducting its sanctions war, its economic war against the Russians, restricting Russian food and fertilizer exports, which, by the way, dwarf those of Ukraine, despite promises that it would not do so, causing even Ukrainian exports of grain to come to a stop. And again, this fixation with imposing these kind of sanctions, sending teams of people around the world now to try to bully countries into enforcing Western sanctions against Russia, which, as I said, these countries have not sanctioned Russia, but they're told that if they don't enforce the Western sanctions against Russia, then they risk being sanctioned themselves. Well, this is all of a piece with what this article is saying about India as well. And of course, it is losing the West friends. Now, India is a big country, it's a powerful country, it's becoming increasingly powerful. The Indians have unsurprisingly told the Westerners to take a running jump. They're not interested. They're now in deep negotiations with the Russians, apparently, about establishing connections between their interbank messaging systems, Russia's and India's. This is outside SWIFT. There's also discussions in India about Indian banks accepting the Mir card and about Russian banks accepting the Indian RuNet card, RuNet being for Rupee Net card. So all of that is apparently going to happen. And I think that if the Americans and the Europeans and the British rock up and tell the Indians, don't do this. Don't dare to do this. You could end up being sanctioned if you do. That is going to make people in India, government of India, even more angry than it already is. Nonetheless, that is our thinking in the West. Everybody must jump to attention and agree with us, even if that means sacrificing the material living standards of their own people. And if they don't, they're not upholding liberal values, they're no longer benign, even neutral democracies. And that word neutral has apparently entirely changed its meaning. It no longer means that which we all once thought it did. Anyway, that is where we have come. I will finish this by saying that another country is now finding itself again under a great deal of economic pressure, and that is Cuba. Cuba, for those who don't know, it's going through a major shortages of oil. Apparently Venezuela has not been able to keep up supplies of oil to Cuba. Maybe it's pulling back on supplies to Cuba as it seeks some kind of rapprochement with the US, who's to say. But anyway, there are major shortages in Cuba of oil, of energy. There's apparently major problems, and this is also causing pressure on food prices there as well. And surprise, surprise, who's stepping in? The old friend from the Cold War years. Apparently the Russians have told the Cubans, look, we're prepared to help you. We're prepared to provide you both with grain, of which we are the world's major supplier, and of course with oil, of which we have vast amounts. And in return, Cuban banks, of course, will also be accepting the Mir card, the Russian Mir card, fairly soon. Now, I don't know how long this process will take. Perhaps it will take a few weeks, a few months. It may take a while for these Russian tankers, perhaps Iranian tankers too, to end up in Cuba to solve the oil supply problems there. But it'll be an interesting development if it happens. We will be back where Cuba is concerned, with a restoration of that old relationship that existed during the Cold War, when the Russians provided Cuba with oil and food, and many other things too, by the way. The Cubans, in return, provided the Russians with some sort of base facilities. I suspect that this time the relationship will take a more commercial aspect. The Russians will probably want to establish their own businesses in Cuba. They've talked in the past of using Cuba as a gateway for exports of Russian goods into Latin America. Who's to say? But anyway, if this happens, which I suspect it will, it'll be another case of what goes round comes round. And perhaps that's unsurprising given the choices that we're making in the West. Well, that's me for today. Thank you for joining me today for this further video. More from me soon. And in the meantime, please remember you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can get yourself all sorts of amazing things like magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, rucksacks, by the way, bottles, all kinds of great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you once more for joining me. More from me soon. We'll see tomorrow whether the counterattack, the Ukrainian counterattack at Bakhmut has materialized and whether this offensive is going to happen in the first half of May or not. Thank you. As I said, more from me soon.